Today, we are going to discuss craving, tanha in Theravada Buddhism. Buddhism is the teaching of Lord Gautama Buddha. Lord Gautama Buddha lived and taught in India during the 6th and 5th century before Christ. Buddha gained enlightenment as Samma Sambuddha while he was meditating under a Bodhi tree in a place called Bodh Gaya, India, and he gained enlightenment with no assistance from any teacher. During the process of enlightenment, the Buddha realized the Four Noble Truths and also the path of liberation from suffering. Having gained enlightenment as a Samma Sambuddha, the Buddha wanted to teach his doctrine and the path of liberation from suffering to others so that they can also cultivate the same path and liberate from suffering. So the Buddha delivered his very first sermon called Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, meaning turning of the wheel of truth, at a place called Varanasi in India. During the Buddha's struggle for enlightenment over a period of 6 years, there were 5 ascetics called Kondanya, Baddiya, Vappa, Mahanama, and Asaji. So when the Buddha gained enlightenment, he decided to teach his doctrine first to his 5 ascetic companions who had helped him during those 6 years. And in that first discourse, the Buddha described the 4 noble truths that he realized during enlightenment. And the first truth is the truth of universal suffering. The second truth is the origin, the causation of suffering. The third truth is the cessation of suffering. And the fourth truth is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. So, in the first noble truth, the Buddha said there is unavoidable, inevitable, and universal suffering, both physical suffering and mental suffering. The second noble truth, the cause of suffering, Buddha described as craving, tanha. And Buddha described 3 types of craving: craving for sensual pleasures, kama tanha; craving for becoming or existence, bhava tanha; and craving for non-becoming or non-existence, vibhava tanha. So the third noble truth is that suffering can be completely eradicated, and that is by attaining the state of nibbana, and is attained by completely abandoning and eliminating all forms of craving. The fourth noble truth, the path leading to the end of suffering, is the Noble Eightfold Path. This Noble Eightfold Path that the Buddha discovered and cultivated in his enlightenment process, provides practical steps that anyone can cultivate and attain enlightenment and liberation from suffering. So, the second noble truth of the origin of suffering is craving, tanha. The Buddha described craving as having three characteristics. Buddha said, Pono bhavika. It produces re-existence and re-becoming. And that's rebirth in this continuing cycle of birth and death, samsara. Nandiraga sahagata. And it's bound up with passionate greed. Tatra tatrabi nandani. Finding fresh delight here and there. So Buddha has described the three types of craving: craving for sensual pleasure, kama-tanha; craving for becoming, bhava-tanha; craving for non-becoming, vibhava-tanha. When we consider the Pali word of tanha, there's really no direct English translation that can convey its proper meaning. There are several meanings: craving, thirst, desire, longing. So craving is a desire that can never be satisfied. And that seems to be the word that is commonly used to describe tanha, the word craving. The desire can sometimes be either positive and wholesome. But with regard to tanha, there is always an element of selfishness. So the term craving has generally been used in the Buddhist literature. Craving can be either to have happy and pleasant experiences or to get rid of any unpleasant experiences. Now, satisfaction that one receives from craving is transient, temporary, doesn't last. And because it is temporary and momentary and doesn't last, it can increase the desire to have even more and more sensory pleasures. And in order to gain it, one can resort to any means, good or bad. And if anything or anyone obstruct, one can develop anger and hatred and can even resort to violence to get what is craved. Now, Buddha has described 7 latent tendencies, anusaya dhammas. Now, latent tendencies exist at a subconscious level. We are not aware that they are there. They exist similar to volcanoes waiting for right conditions to explode. And the right conditions are when one receives sensory objects through the 6 internal sensory doors: the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. And the Buddha has described 7 latent tendencies. And the very first one is latent tendency of desire for sensual pleasures, kama raga anusaya. And the others are latent tendency of aversion, latent tendency of conceit, latent tendency of wrong view, latent tendency of doubt, latent tendency of desire for existence, latent tendency of ignorance. So among the 7 latent tendencies, 2 are to do with craving. The first one is the desire, craving for sensual pleasures. And the 6th is the latent tendency of desire for existence. As long as this latent tendency of craving is there, suffering will also continue. There's a book called Dhammapada, which contains Buddha saying in verse form. There are 423 verses in the Dhammapada. And in the verse 338, the Buddha said, if its root remains undamaged and strong, a tree, even if cut, will grow back. And similarly, if latent craving is not rooted out, the suffering returns again and again. Now, Buddha has described another group of 4 mental defilements called asava in Pali, and they are called cankers, taints, or fermentations. And the 4 fermentations are desire for sense pleasure, kamasava, desire for continued existence, bhavasava, false views, ditthasava, and ignorance, avijjasava. And here again, out of the 4 fermentations, the first 2, desire for sense pleasure and desire for continued existence, are 2 forms of craving. The Buddha has also described another group of 10 mental defilements called fetters, sangyojana. And these fetters are sort of chains or shackles that bind sentient beings to the cycle of birth and death, the samsara. And they need to be gradually eradicated when one cultivates the Buddhist path of liberation from suffering. And the 10 fetters are self-identity view, sakkaya ditthi, skeptical doubt, vichikicha, attachment to mere rites and rituals, silabbata paramasa, sensual desire, kamaraga, ill will, patiga, desire to be born in fine material worlds, ruparaga, desire to be born in formless Brahma worlds, aruparaga, conceit, mana, restlessness, uddhacha, and ignorance, avijja. And out of the 10 fetters, we can see the 4th one, sensual desire, then the 6th and 7th, desire to be born in fine material Brahma worlds or formless Brahma worlds, are 3 forms of craving. In the Salayaka Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, that's the discourse from the collection of the Buddha's middle-length discourses. The Buddha described 10 unwholesome actions that we performed based on the 3 unwholesome roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. And Buddha divided them into 3 groups. The first group are the 3 bodily actions: killing any living beings, stealing or taking what is not given, and sexual misconduct. The group of 4 verbal actions include false speech, slanderous speech, harsh speech, and idle chattering. And the group of 3 mental actions include covetousness, ill will, and wrong will. And here, covetousness means craving for things that belong to other people. So it's also a form of severe craving. And in a discourse called Tanha Sutta in the Anguttara Nikaya, that is the collection of Buddha's numerical discourses, the Buddha described craving as a sticky net that traps living beings. And Buddha said, this world is choked by craving, engulfed by it. Craving makes this world tangled like yarn, knotted like a ball of thread, and matted like rushes and reeds. And not escaping from craving can lead one to a rebirth in worlds of deprivation. In another discourse called Ahara Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, that is the collection of the Buddha's connected discourses, the Buddha described 4 types of nutriments that sustain and maintain living beings in the cycle of birth and death. And the first type of nutriment, Buddha said, material food, gross or refined, kabalinka ahara. The second type of nutriment is the contact between sense organs and corresponding sense objects, passahara. Third type of nutriment is mental volition or intentions, mano sanchetana ahara. And the fourth type of nutriment is consciousness, vijnana ahara. And for all the 4 types of nutriments, Buddha said, craving is the main cause. Now, during the process of enlightenment, the Buddha realized the 4 noble truths as well as dependent origination, paticca samuppada. Now, dependent origination is a key aspect of the Buddha's teaching. And it shows how we continue to be reborn and dead in the cycle of birth and death. And it also says that nothing in this universe appears on its own accord. Everything appears based on other conditions or interdependent causes. And independent origination also shows how suffering begins and how suffering ends. And it consists of 12 links. And we can see the 8th link is tanha, craving. So in the dependent origination, the Buddha said, ignorance conditions mental formations. Mental formations condition consciousness. Consciousness conditions mind and matter. Mind and matter conditions the 6 sense bases. The 6 sense bases conditions contact. Contact conditions feeling. Feeling conditions craving. Craving conditions clinging. Clinging conditions becoming. Becoming conditions birth. And conditions by birth, aging, death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair appears. So craving here is conditioned by feeling, Vedana, and its conditions clinging, that's Upadana, and also becoming, resulting in a rebirth associated with all its suffering. So craving is a significant factor in the 12 linked dependent origination. Now let us look at the 3 forms of craving that Buddha described in his first discourse, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. The first is craving for sensual pleasures, kama tanha. And this is the intense desire, craving for sensual pleasures from the sense objects that we receive through the six sense doors: the eye, the ear, the nose, the tongue, the body, and the mind. And in the Vibhanga Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, Buddha said there are six forms of craving based on the sense objects that we received. So, craving for pleasant visible objects received through the eye, craving for pleasant sounds received through the ear, craving for pleasant odors received through the nose, craving for pleasant taste received through the tongue, craving for pleasant tactile objects or touch sensations received through the body, and craving for pleasant mental phenomena like ideas and thoughts received through the mind. The main reason for craving for sensual pleasure is actually ignorance. Ignorance of the three universal characteristics. The Buddha has said that every thing in this universe has three universal characteristics, and that is they are impermanent, anicca, they lead to unsatisfactoriness or suffering, dukkha, and there is no permanent entity called a self or soul, anatta. But through four ways of our perverted thinking, this vipallasa, we consider what is impermanent as permanent, what is painful as pleasurable, what is not self as self, and what is unattractive as attractive. Now, no sense desire can be satisfied because any sense object of craving that we receive is transient and short lived. So, pleasant feeling that we receive from them, because they are momentary and transient, can lead to dissatisfaction and suffering. And that will create craving for more sensual pleasures that could not be satisfied. Now, craving for material possessions can lead to suffering in three ways. Now, there is suffering in trying to get what is craved. There is suffering involved in trying to protect once we have obtained it. And there is suffering if we lose it. Now, craving for sensual pleasures can lead to all type of unethical actions. If there are objects or people who can object our attempt to gain the sensual pleasures, one can resort to killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, use of alcohol and drugs. And the craving for sensual pleasures can also lead to interpersonal problems, family problems, and even family breakups, acts of hatred. Some people might resort to self-harm and suicide, and even to homicide. Now, Buddha has said in the Migajala Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, even if a monk lives in isolation in a jungle, not associating with anyone, as long as that person has craving for sensual pleasures in his mind, he still has a companion. he is not alone. But even if one has been living in a village or town, associating with other people, if he has eliminated all cravings, he can be considered as someone who is living alone with no companion. Now, the second type of craving is the craving for becoming or existence, bhavatanha. Now, bhava means being, becoming, worldly existence. So, craving to become something or someone in this life is bhavatanha. And it can also mean having a craving to continue to exist in future lives. And this craving is associated with one's belief of a permanent entity called an ego, a soul, or self, which is absolute and eternal. And this is the wrong view of eternality, sasvataditti. And this could lead one to have a desire to be born in sensual worlds, fine material Brahma worlds, or formless Brahma worlds. In the Tanha Sutta of the Anguttara Nikaya, the Buddha said that one cannot pinpoint to a moment in time before which craving for existence did not exist. And in the same discourse, Buddha said it is ignorance that acts as the nutrient for craving for existence. So, craving for existence is really conditions by ignorance. And ignorance and craving together are the two main factors that keep sentient beings in the cycle of birth and death. Craving for non becoming or non existence, that's vibhava tanha, is the desire to get rid of something, and that includes not to exist after death. And this desire can be to get rid of something one may not like or cannot cope with, such as an unbearable physical or mental pain, suffering, unpleasant people, or unpleasant situations. Now, craving for non existence is associated with the wrong view of annihilations, and that is uchcheda ditti. Now, people who got the wrong view of annihilation believes that there is an entity called soul or self, and the soul and the body are one and the same. So when one dies, both the soul and the body are annihilated with nothing remaining. Now, those who believe in annihilation theory, they are nihilistic and materialistic. And being materialistic, they will go for every possible object of sensual desire in order to enjoy their life to the fullest. And in trying to obtain those sensual pleasures, they don't care how they receive it. And they can commit any evil action because they believe that they will not have to face any negative consequence of their unwholesome actions. And because of that belief, that they are also not inclined to do any meritorious actions in this life. Now, if we consider self-harming behavior in somebody, that may also be due to craving for non-existence. And suicide can also be considered as an extreme form of desire for non-existence. Now let us look at craving, tanha, and desire, chanda. Now desire, chanda, is one of 6 occasional mental factors, cetasikas, in the Buddha's higher teaching called Abhidhamma. And chanda is also an ethically variable mental factor because it can be wholesome or unwholesome, depending on whether it is associated with the wholesome volition or an unwholesome volition. Now, craving always referred to unwholesome desire or greed. But on the other hand, desire could either be wholesome or unwholesome, depending on the context. It could be an unwholesome desire or wholesome desire based on whether they are based on unwholesome mental roots like greed, hatred, and delusion, or wholesome roots, that is, non greed, non hatred, and non delusion. Now, craving for sensual pleasures, kama tanha, craving for existence, bhava tanha, and craving for non existence, vibhava tanha, are all unwholesome desires. And they lead to suffering and continued existence in the cycle of birth and death. Now, if we take desire to perform meritorious actions like giving, dana, or observing the moral precept, sila, and meditation, bhavana, they have a wholesome desire. Buddha has described a group of 4 bases of mental power that one needs to cultivate during one's journey to enlightenment and nibbana. And they are called iddhipada. And the first of the 4 mental bases of mental power is the desire or will to act, chanda. Effort, virya, consciousness, chitta, and investigation or discrimination, vimamsa. So, wholesome desire, a chanda, is the first of the 4 bases of mental power, iddhipadas. Now, let us look at craving and clinging. In the Vibhanga Sutta of the Samyutta Nikaya, in which the Buddha described and analyzed dependent origination, Buddha described 4 types of clinging. Clinging to sensual pleasure, kama-upadana; clinging to wrong views, ditthi-upadana; clinging to rites and rituals, sila-upadana; and clinging to the doctrine of a self, atta-upadana. So in dependent origination, craving conditions clinging and clinging conditions becoming. Now let us look at how one could eradicate craving. And if we go back to the 4 noble truths, the first truth of suffering, the second truth of the origin of suffering, that is craving, and then truth of cessation of suffering, that is by eradicating all forms of craving. And the 4th truth is the path leading to the cessation of suffering. So the Buddha's path of liberation, that is Noble Eightfold Path, is the path to eradicate suffering in all forms and attain the state of Nibbana. And there are 8 factors of the Noble Eightfold Path: right view, samadhi; right intention, samma sankappa; right speech, samma vacha; right action, samma kammanta; right livelihood, samma ajiva; right effort, samma vayama; right mindfulness, samma sati; and right concentration, samma samadhi. And for practical purposes, these 8 factors are divided into 3 groups. The first group is morality, sila, and that consists of right speech, right action, and right livelihood. The second group is concentration, samadhi, and that consists of right effort, right mindfulness, and right concentration. The third group is wisdom, panya, and that consists of right understanding and right intention. So when one cultivates the Noble Eightfold Path successfully and diligently, as instructed by the Buddha, the final result is enlightenment or nibbana, and that is attained through 4 progressive stages. The first stage is stream enterer, sotapanna. The second stage is once returner, sakadagami. The third stage is non-returner, anagami. And the fourth and final stage is arahant. So an arahant who is fully enlightened has completely eradicated all forms of craving. And because of that, the arahanthood is called tanhakkhaya. Now, in verse 216 of the Dhammapada, the Buddha has stated that craving leads to grief and fear, and one has no craving, there is no grief or fear. Tanhaya jayati soko, tanhaya jayati bhayam, tanhaya vippamuttas natti soko kuto bhayam. From craving springs grief, from craving springs fear. For him who is wholly free from craving, there is no grief. How can there be fear? Thank you very much.